how the super empath's detachment turns the avoidance coldness against them. You know that moment when someone who once pulled away suddenly starts chasing you. It's not magic. It's not manipulation. It's emotional gravity shifting. Because when a super empath, the one who always gave too much, finally detaches, the avoidance coldness stops feeling powerful and starts feeling lonely. Let's talk about a dynamic that drives so many people crazy, the empath and the avoidant. The empath feels everything deeply. They see the potential in others, they nurture, they reach out, they care even when it hurts. The avoidant. They crave closeness but fear it at the same time. They pull back the moment things feel too intimate. Now, for a long time, this dance feels like punishment for the empath. They give, the other withdraws, they explain, they overthink, they try harder and end up feeling empty. But here's where everything changes. When the super empath finally stops chasing, when they detach not from anger, but from clarity, when they no longer need to prove their worth to someone who keeps stepping back, suddenly the balance flips. Because the avoidance power was never their distance. It was the empath's reaction to it. When the reaction disappears, the avoidant is left alone with the silence they once thought they wanted. And that silence, it's louder than any argument. Detachment is not revenge. It's alignment. It's the empath saying, I don't need to fix you to feel full. And that calm, grounded energy, the kind that no longer chases, becomes irresistible. Because what the avoidant runs from isn't love, it's pressure. But when love no longer chases, it becomes safe. And that's when the avoidant starts to lean back in. So remember, your power isn't in how much you can feel. It's in how much peace you can hold while letting go. When a super empath finally begins to detach, something subtle yet profound happens. The emotional gravity between them and the avoidant shifts. For so long, the avoidant's distance seemed like power. They could pull away, go silent, or become emotionally unavailable, and the empath would feel the absence like a vacuum. It would pull at them, tug at their heart, make them question their worth, and drive them into cycles of explaining, fixing, and over-giving. The avoidant, consciously or not, felt in control because their withdrawal created movement, the empath's movement. Every time the avoidant stepped back, the empath leaned in. Every time the avoidant became cold, the empath turned up the warmth. It became a loop where emotional imbalance disguised itself as chemistry. But when the empath's heart finally grows tired, not broken, just tired, something extraordinary happens. They stop reacting. They stop chasing clarity from someone who hides behind confusion. They stop performing emotional CPR on a relationship that only one person is keeping alive. And in that moment, the energetic current between them snaps. The avoidance coldness no longer feels like power. It becomes emptiness. The empath, who once trembled at the idea of being ignored, now realizes that silence is not rejection. It's information. It's a clear reflection of where emotional investment has not been matched. What makes this shift so powerful is that the avoidant sense of control depends entirely on the empath's emotional responsiveness. Their coldness only works when it elicits warmth. Their withdrawal only feels safe when someone is still waiting on the other side. Once the empath's detachment sets in, the avoidance strategy collapses. The dynamic that once gave them reassurance, I can pull away and they'll still be there, now gives them nothing. The space they created no longer produces pursuit. It produces peace. And peace, for the avoidant, is deeply unsettling. The empath's detachment isn't a strategy or manipulation, it's an energetic shift born from exhaustion and awakening. They've reached a point where they understand that emotional safety can't be negotiated with someone who uses distance as a defense. They stop trying to decode mixed signals or translate emotional unavailability into potential. Their energy, which once flowed outward in empathy and effort, begins to flow inward, into themselves. This reclamation of emotional energy is what truly flips the dynamic, because the empath's greatest strength was never in how much they could feel for others, it was in how deeply they could connect. When that connection is withdrawn from someone who takes it for granted, the absence is felt immediately. The avoidant starts to notice the shift. At first, they might feel relief, no pressure, no pursuit. But soon, that relief turns into discomfort. The familiar chase that once validated their importance is gone. The silence that used to mean control now feels like isolation. The empath's energy, once a comforting background presence, has vanished. And it's in that emptiness that the avoidant begins to feel what the empath felt all along. the sting of emotional distance. What was once an imbalance now becomes a mirror. The avoidance coldness reflects back on them. Their distance no longer draws love, it highlights the absence of it. And the empath, standing in their newfound calm, no longer tries to fill that gap. They've discovered something more powerful than attachment: alignment. Their focus shifts from how can I make them stay to does this connection make me feel safe? In the end, this shift in energy doesn't just change the relationship, it changes the empath's entire way of relating. They no longer define intimacy through effort, but through reciprocity. They realize that when emotional energy stops chasing resistance, it stops being drained. The avoidance coldness loses its power because it no longer controls the rhythm. The dance stops, and for the first time, both are left facing themselves, one in silence, the other in peace. Detachment often gets misunderstood. People hear the word and think it means shutting down, becoming cold, or no longer caring. But when a super empath detaches, it's not about building walls, it's about coming home to clarity. For so long, the empath's heart has been open, almost too open. They've been reading between every line, feeling every unspoken word, and carrying the emotional weight of the connection. Their attachment is not just about love, it's about understanding, fixing, and healing. But this constant emotional labor leaves them drained. When the empath finally reaches the point of detachment, it isn't a reaction born from resentment or punishment. It's a quiet decision rooted in self-preservation and awareness. Clarity changes everything. It brings the realization that love cannot survive in one-sided spaces. The empath begins to see that their empathy, as beautiful as it is, cannot thrive in a place where it isn't reciprocated. For so long, they mistook effort for connection, thinking that if they just loved harder, the other person would eventually meet them halfway. Detachment breaks the illusion. It shows the empath that connection isn't measured by how much energy you give, but by how safe you feel when you give it. This kind of detachment doesn't look loud or dramatic. It's calm, grounded, and often confusing to the avoidant who once held the emotional upper hand. The avoidant has grown accustomed to the empath's over-functioning, the reassurance, the explanations, the checking in, the emotional availability that never ran out. When the empath detaches, the temperature of the entire relationship changes. The emotional warmth that used to fill every silence begins to fade, and what's left is space, pure unfilled space. For the avoidant, that space feels foreign, even threatening. For the empath, it feels liberating. Clarity turns detachment into strength. The empath begins to see the dynamic for what it really is, a pattern of overgiving and under-receiving. They no longer internalize the avoidance distance as something wrong with them. Instead, they recognize it as the other person's emotional limitation. That awareness softens their need to chase. It allows them to breathe without waiting for a reply, to find calm in their own company, and to let silence speak louder than effort. They stop making excuses for why the avoidant pulls away and instead begin to accept that some people can only meet love at the depth they are comfortable with, and that depth may not match their own. There's something incredibly powerful about that kind of acceptance. It transforms pain into peace. The empath's energy becomes clean, no longer tangled in the constant emotional negotiation that once defined the relationship. They no longer perform emotional acrobatics to earn closeness. Their boundaries become quiet but firm. They don't need to prove that they care. Their clarity speaks for itself. And that clarity radiates differently. It's the kind of energy that says, I can love you, but I will not lose myself trying to reach you. This calm detachment often unsettles the avoidant because it breaks the familiar push-pull dynamic. The empath is no longer reacting to coldness with more warmth, they are responding with balance. That neutrality feels strange to someone who's used to control through withdrawal. Suddenly, their distance doesn't produce guilt reassurance or pursuit, it produces nothing. And in that nothingness, the avoidant feels the void of their own actions. The silence that once made them feel powerful now echoes with self-reflection. The empath, meanwhile, begins to rediscover themselves outside the emotional roller coaster. They start to enjoy stillness, their own thoughts, and the peace that comes from no longer being emotionally entangled with someone else's patterns. They realize that detachment doesn't mean indifference. It means freedom from confusion. It's the moment when love stops being about proving and starts being about truth. The beauty of this clarity is that it brings compassion without attachment. The empath can see the avoidant struggle without needing to fix it. They can understand their fear of intimacy without internalizing it. They can care without clinging. That's the quiet power of detachment. It's not the absence of emotion, but the presence of perspective. The heart is still open, but it no longer bleeds for what refuses to meet it halfway. When the super empath detaches, something begins to happen that the avoidant never expects. Their own silence starts to echo back at them. For the longest time, silence was their shield. It was their escape hatch, their way of regaining control whenever intimacy felt too close or emotions felt overwhelming. When the empath would lean in with questions, affection, or attempts to connect, the avoidant would pull back. That withdrawal was their comfort zone, the space where they could feel safe from emotional intensity. They believed that distance gave them power, that silence meant safety. But what they didn't realize was that the empath's response was what gave that silence its meaning. The empath's reaction made the avoidant's coldness feel effective. Every unanswered text, every emotional shutdown, every vague response. It all created a ripple that the empath would try to soothe. They would over-explain, over-give, and overthink, desperately trying to close the emotional gap. Their energy kept the connection alive, even when the avoidant was barely participating. But once the empath detaches, that current stops flowing. The avoidant's silence no longer receives a reaction. Their absence no longer triggers a chase. And in that stillness, for the first time, they are forced to face the emptiness their own patterns created. Silence has always been the avoidance armor, but when it stops being met with noise, it turns into a mirror. It reflects back their fears, their loneliness, and the emotional walls they've built to protect themselves. Without the empath's constant emotional presence, the avoidant starts to experience the void that their detachment once imposed on someone else. The space that once gave them relief from intimacy now begins to feel like isolation. They start to sense what it's like to reach out emotionally and find nothing there, the same nothing the empath felt for so long. The power dynamic begins to shift not because the empath tries to reverse it, but because energy always seeks balance. The empath's calm withdrawal removes the emotional stimulus that the avoidant subconsciously relied on. Their coldness was never true control. It was an avoidance of vulnerability. The moment there's no longer someone reacting to it, that avoidance stands exposed. The silence they used to manage closeness becomes uncomfortable, almost haunting. The avoidant, who once believed they were safest alone, begins to realize that safety without connection isn't safety at all. It's emptiness dressed as comfort. For the empath, this moment of detachment is peaceful. They've finally stopped trying to fill in the emotional blanks. They're not punishing or ignoring. They're simply no longer feeding a pattern that drained them. Their energy has turned inward, and that inner calm radiates differently. There's no anger, no begging, no dramatic exit, just absence. And it's that absence that speaks the loudest. The avoidant begins to notice the shift not through words, but through the silence that now mirrors their own. The irony is that the empath's silence carries more truth than all their past explanations combined. It says, I understand now. I don't need to fight for something that isn't being offered freely. That quiet truth pierces deeper than confrontation ever could. It destabilizes the avoidant's emotional defenses because it removes the conflict they've always prepared for. There's nothing to resist, no one to blame, and nowhere to hide. All that remains is the sound of their own emotional distance. Over time, the avoidant begins to feel drawn back, not out of manipulation, but because the energy has changed. The empath's detachment creates a space where authenticity could finally exist if the avoidant chooses it. But for many, this is also the moment of awakening. They see, maybe for the first time, how much the empath carried the connection. The silence they once used to protect themselves becomes unbearable when it's no longer met with warmth. And this is the quiet power of the empath's detachment. It doesn't chase, it doesn't fight, and it doesn't plead. It simply reflects. The avoidance coldness, once a tool of control, becomes the very thing that turns inward on them. The silence that used to keep them safe now reminds them of what they've lost. Not because the empath disappeared, but because they finally stopped trying to reach someone who never reached back. Peace has a different kind of power. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, and it doesn't demand attention, yet it has a pull that's almost magnetic. When the super empath finally finds peace within themselves, that energy begins to change everything around them. For so long, the empath's instinct was to reach, to soothe, to give, to prove their value through love and care. Their pursuit was genuine, but it was also exhausting. Every time the avoidant withdrew, the empath felt compelled to move closer, believing that enough understanding or affection could melt the other person's distance. The avoidant became accustomed to being chased, not necessarily because they wanted control, but because pursuit felt familiar and validation from being needed masked their fear of true vulnerability. But when the empath stops chasing and instead finds peace, the entire dynamic begins to unravel. That peace isn't indifference, it's emotional balance. It's the calm that comes from no longer trying to change what can't be changed. The empath begins to understand that they cannot love someone into readiness. They cannot earn closeness from a person who equates intimacy with loss of independence. In this clarity, the empath's energy shifts from pursuit to presence. They stop seeking reassurance outside of themselves, and that stillness is powerful. It creates an emotional gravity of its own. The avoidant, who once felt suffocated by the empath's closeness, suddenly finds themselves drawn toward that peace. Because while avoidants fear intensity, they are quietly drawn to calm. The empath's pursuit may have triggered the avoidant's defense mechanisms, but their serenity does the opposite. It feels safe. The avoidant can sense when the energy has changed. The air between them feels lighter, more grounded, less demanding. What used to feel like emotional pressure now feels like stability. And ironically, that stability becomes attractive. The empath's peace is magnetic because it communicates a message without words. I'm okay whether you come closer or not. That confidence is what creates true emotional polarity. The avoidant, who once controlled the distance, begins to feel uncertain. They sense that the empath no longer needs their attention to feel whole, and that subtle independence disrupts the familiar rhythm of the relationship. It's no longer about one chasing and one retreating. It's about two people standing still, one in peace and the other in discomfort. This shift exposes something the avoidant never realized, that they were not being pursued for validation, but for connection. And now, with the chase gone, they begin to see the value of what they kept pushing away. The empath's calm energy becomes a mirror of what the avoidant secretly craves: safety without control, intimacy without overwhelm, love without pressure. The same qualities that once scared them now appear softer, more approachable, and strangely compelling. For the empath, this peace is not something they perform. It's something they become. It's the byproduct of emotional self-respect. They stop investing in uncertainty and start choosing themselves in quiet, consistent ways. They don't withdraw to punish or to make a point. They simply live in a way that doesn't depend on reaction. Their emotional energy is now reserved for people and places that reciprocate. They're no longer negotiating for crumbs because they've remembered what a full table feels like. That kind of peace cannot be faked. It radiates subtly through slower responses, relaxed boundaries, softer tones, and the absence of urgency. It's not a game of, let me make you chase me. It's simply, I no longer need to chase you. And in that truth, the avoidant often starts to lean back in. Not because they've been manipulated, but because the tension that once pushed them away has dissolved. This is why peace becomes more magnetic than pursuit. The empath's stillness allows space for real connection to grow, not one driven by anxiety or imbalance, but by curiosity and choice. The avoidant, sensing the absence of pressure, can finally approach without fear. What was once a dance of distance becomes an invitation to meet in the middle. Not through force, but through resonance. The empath's calm becomes a frequency the avoidant didn't know they needed until they lost it. Power takes on a completely new meaning when the super empath learns to contain their emotional energy. For much of their life, their strength has been measured by how much they can give, how deeply they can feel, and how tirelessly they can show up for others. Their empathy has always been their superpower, but also their greatest vulnerability. They've poured themselves into people who couldn't meet them at the same depth, believing that their love could be enough to bridge any emotional gap. This constant outpouring left them depleted, and yet they continued, thinking that giving more meant loving better. It takes time and often heartbreak for the empath to realize that the power they've been searching for doesn't come from reaching outward, but from drawing inward. When they begin to contain their emotional energy, something profound shifts. It's not that they stop caring or feeling, it's that they stop leaking energy into spaces where it's not honored. Containment means knowing that not everyone deserves access to your emotional depth. It's the understanding that sensitivity is sacred, not a tool for proving your worth. The empath starts to recognize that constantly pouring into someone who gives nothing back isn't compassion, it's self-abandonment. By holding their energy close, they start to rebuild the sense of safety that they've long outsourced to others. The avoidant, who once benefited from the empath's overflow, begins to feel the change immediately. The emotional cushion that used to soften their detachment disappears. The empath's energy, once so easily accessible, is now protected. There's no longer an endless supply of reassurance, patience, or emotional translation. Instead, there's a quiet boundary, not defensive, but firm. The empath no longer explains their feelings to someone who doesn't listen, nor do they chase connection through over-communication. Their calm presence replaces their constant effort, and that shift carries a silent authority. Power in this sense is not about dominance or control, it's about emotional sovereignty. The empath realizes that they are not powerless just because someone doesn't choose them. They are powerful because they can choose themselves. This awareness is what makes them emotionally untouchable. When the avoidant withdraws, the empath doesn't spiral, they observe. When communication fades, they don't panic, they pause. When affection cools, they don't beg, they breathe. This ability to stay grounded in uncertainty is what transforms them from a reactor into a creator, someone who shapes their emotional experience instead of being shaped by it. This self-containment radiates confidence, but it's not performative. It's a steady energy that says, I know my value, and I won't negotiate it for closeness. That kind of peace makes the avoidance tactics ineffective. Emotional unavailability loses its power when it no longer provokes anxiety. The avoidant can no longer draw reassurance from seeing the empath's distress because there is none. The empath has learned that self-regulation is the antidote to emotional manipulation. They understand that their feelings are valid, but not everyone is capable of holding them, and that's okay because they now can. As the empath grows into this power, they become more selective with their emotional investments. They no longer confuse chemistry with compatibility or intensity with intimacy. They understand that love should feel safe, not suspenseful. Their boundaries become a reflection of self-respect, not a wall built from pain. And the more they protect their peace, the more their energy becomes magnetic in a new way. People are drawn to calm, grounded energy because it feels stable. It feels like truth. The irony is that by becoming self-contained, the empath doesn't become detached from love, they become better at it. Their love becomes purer because it's no longer mixed with fear or need. They can offer connection without losing themselves in it. And that is the kind of presence that changes the dynamic entirely. The avoidant, once comfortable in control, starts to feel the quiet strength of someone who no longer needs them to feel whole. That's when the dynamic flips completely. Not because the empath won a game, but because they finally stopped playing one. When we finally understand the dynamic between the super empath and the avoidant, we realize it was never about winning or losing. It was about awakening. The empath's journey isn't to become colder or harder, but wiser. To recognize that their love was never the problem, it was simply misplaced. Their capacity to feel deeply, to connect genuinely, and to love wholeheartedly is not a weakness, it's their brilliance. But that brilliance only shines when it's protected by boundaries and guided by self-respect. The avoidant, too, is not the villain. Their distance comes from fear. Fear of being consumed, fear of losing control, fear of needing someone who might not stay. But when the empath steps back into balance, something changes for both. The empath no longer sacrifices peace to prove love, and the avoidant no longer feels suffocated by connection. The energy becomes cleaner, more honest, and in that honesty, real growth can happen, or real endings can be accepted. This is the beauty of emotional evolution. When the empath detaches from chaos and reconnects to themselves, they stop operating from need and start living from alignment. They stop chasing what drains them and begin attracting what matches their peace. The avoidance coldness no longer feels like rejection. It becomes redirection, pushing the empath back to their own center, where their true power lies. So if you're the empath who has always felt too much, remember this: your depth is not a flaw, it's your gift. You just need to stop giving it to people who can't swim in it. When you find your calm, you reclaim your control. When you stop proving your worth, you finally see it. And when you love without losing yourself, you step into the most magnetic version of you. One that no longer needs to chase love because love naturally flows toward peace. Thank you for sharing this space and this reflection. If you take one thing from this, let it be this: your energy is your most valuable currency. Spend it wisely, protect it fiercely, and remember, the right connection will never require you to abandon yourself to keep it. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for growing. Take your peace with you, because that's where your real power begins.